Welcome to Iowa, and this is the video where we count down the 10 smallest incorporated towns in the state. Now, these are all towns that have some form of government. They're officially incorporated. They're not ghost towns. They're not unincorporated. So if you don't see your town or a town that you are aware of, it's probably because it's unincorporated. And so these are the 10 smallest incorporated. Actually, there's 12 because we have a couple ties for 10th. And so yeah, let's get on with the list. Coburg used to have about 200 people, and obviously is about a 10th of that size now in terms of population. It was a railroad town, and so like a lot of these towns that you're going to see, that was built up at a certain period of time, and then they just over time got smaller and smaller as the railroad closed down and people moved away because there weren't really jobs to speak of anymore around here. An interesting tidbit about Coburg: it was the location of the Iowa Mounted Guard in 1860. This is where they came to do drilling activities to be ready for action if need be, and doesn't appear they ever were pressed into action, but it was a group that met here. Today, as you stroll around, there's not much left of the old days. I'm standing next to this scale, obviously by the railroad, so there were probably buildings. This is Commercial Street right here, and so I'm assuming there were businesses here, and there's really not much. I did drive up kind of onto a back road, and I saw, I think, what is a school on private property. It's kind of behind some weeds and everything, but not too much to see. Some colorful houses in the area. Yeah, pretty quiet little community. Hepburn was never very large. And it's obviously not very large to this day, but the little bit of population that it did have was kind of a result of some coal mining, and population went above 100, but then it's been pretty much small for many decades, and there's not much left to see. I think this was a bank building right here. This is Railroad Street, so obviously there was a railroad that went through here and has long since gone away. I'm here by the railroad in Galt, and it's because that's why this town was started. The settlement was around 1880, and it was known as Norwich, I think, by the people that lived here. And then the railroad came in and they renamed it Galtville, and then about 1888 it officially changed to Galt, just dropped the Ville. And then it didn't incorporate until 1913, and it was pretty significant to the people in this area. It was kind of a center for the agricultural area and the farmers, and was maybe 200 people at the most. And then around 1960, it fell under triple digits for the first time, and then has slowly declined ever since. Driving around, it looks like a regular kind of small town. There's not a lot of abandoned buildings. There's a couple old houses. There's the old railroad depot, I'm assuming, there, here by the kind of newer buildings. So, but yeah, not a ton of signs or of old things or abandoned things here in Galt, but a nice little town to visit. Berkley is one of the first towns I've visited here in this list that feels like a ghost town. And I'm here, I'm assuming this was an old school. I think this is the city hall. I saw some kind of printout of some resolutions. Maybe this is the city hall. I don't know. It doesn't look like it's in very good condition, as are a lot of the buildings in town. This was a railroad town, started in 1883. It was originally called Summersville, and it never got very big. It hit 100 once in the census through the years, and has been pretty small, kind of this size, for several decades. It's definitely quiet and a little strange to explore around Berkley. I'm inside the impressive church here in Bankston, and sometimes you go to a small town and the churches are open and you're free to go in and check it out. And this is a very impressive town or very impressive church for as small as the town is. There's also an old schoolhouse here. This is an old town. The community was settled in 1835. It didn't become an official town, though, until the 1930s. There were several towns in the area that were known as beer towns, and they were incorporated so they could sell alcohol, and this was one of them. And it grew to a little bit more than it is now, obviously, but has diminished, but some very impressive structures to check out while you're here. We're here in the Maloy City Park, and not a huge park, but at least they have a park. The sign here, the kind of welcome sign to the town, tells a little bit of the history of the town. There's a railroad there, and that's why this was started, along the railroad. And then there's a church, which is actually still here, a very impressive looking church. And Maloy grew to, it was pretty small, but it did have over 100 people, and started to decline. They had a school, they had businesses here, and then the population started to decline. And then in the 1970s, the school closed. In the 1980s, the railroad stopped. And then you can see the population figures pretty much went in half, during that time, and it's continued to dwindle and get smaller. But there are a couple old buildings still kind of here in the downtown, kind of Main Street area. And then, like I said, the church is a very impressive structure to see. Durango is a pretty interesting little town. I'm walking on the Heritage Trail, and the Heritage Trail comes right through Durango here. It goes a lot of different places. I actually saw a cross-country team, high school cross-country team, take off running. Would be a good place to go for a run or a bike ride. But Durango was originally a few miles from here, and then the railroad bypassed it, and they moved here. And this area was known as Timber Loggins. And it was because it was a mining area, timber area, and it's, that's where the community in the 1830s decided to pick up and move over here. And it was incorporated and unincorporated many times throughout the 1800s. And then finally in 1933, it was incorporated for the final time, which it still is. And just like a couple towns ago, I was talking about Bankston, how it was a beer town. Same thing. We're just a few miles from Bankston, actually. So these two were two of about 10 towns near Dubuque that were beer towns where they could sell alcohol. But very cool. They got some couple old buildings. They got a funny police car keeping tabs on the traffic through town. And obviously the Heritage Trail, there's a restaurant / bar in town. So cool little place to visit. Sometimes you can't find much online about these towns, and so you just show up and I hope you find something. And that's what happened here with Yetter. I couldn't find anything except for that the town was platted in 1899. It was named after one of the settlers. And so I got here and just driving around, and it's they've got a really modern elevators, and obviously probably a strong agricultural area here, and then just mostly just normal houses, a couple abandoned houses. And then I found this park on Main Street. Now, Main Street maybe at one time was, more robust than it is, but it's a very short street, and there's really one building on it, one old building, and then this park. And I walk up, and on the rock they have kind of like donors of who donated to, the gazebo here. It's behind me, and it said Centennial 1904 to 2004. So that gave me a little bit of information. And then as you walk into the gazebo, it tells a little bit about the town's history, about who it was named after, and how it was incorporated in December 1903. First elections 1904. And so there's a little bit of history to find here in Yetter. And the funniest thing was that on the rock there where it talked about the Centennial has the little town saying, "Everything's better in Yetter." So haven't been here long enough to know if that's true, but it's certainly a nice little town. Ellston is probably one of the nicer towns you're going to find on this list. It's a lot of organized history as you walk around town. Some more modern buildings, but also some old historical buildings. The story about kind of the early days of Ellston's pretty interesting. In 1881, there was a couple that started a store here thinking the railroad might come through here, and then it failed. A few months later, the railroad hadn't come through here yet, and then the railroad did come through here, and a settlement was started. Wirt was what the original, those original people named this place, and it was getting confused with a nearby town called Van Wert, and so the post office changed it to Ellston in like 1895, about 13 years later after it was started. Another interesting thing, the road kind of right behind me, the main road that goes through town, is part of what was called Dragoon Trace, and this was a early, I guess you'd call it, road or path that was interestingly enough started by animals that they knew the paths across the rivers and the streams and the creeks, and they basically formed a path to get through this part of Iowa and into Missouri. And then eventually Native Americans found that path, and it became one of their ways to travel, and then settlers as well. And so pretty interesting how a road today was originally formed by animals. As I was saying, it's a very nice town. I actually met some ladies here that were working on some of the kind of landscaping and different things, and they told me, that it's pretty much still a town because of the nearby lake. I think it's called Sun Valley Lake, and it was several hundred people early in its days and has gotten much smaller, but has a function still because it's close to the lake. And there's actually an old building in town, was originally an opera house, and they've turned it into a business, and so really cool place to visit. we've advanced our way through the list to Conway. And I was curious about this one as I was looking, because this is probably the town on this list that was the biggest. There were over 400 people in the late 1800s here, and now it's down to 17, and in fact it's gone from 41 to 17, so it's rapidly decreasing and getting smaller and smaller with every census. And it had a good population for quite a while, but I couldn't find a lot of information about it online, except that it was a railroad town and had businesses like all these towns do. And then I was driving around, and it's just, there's abandoned buildings everywhere. There's houses falling down, a couple of decent houses so you can see where a few people live, where the 17 people might live, and but just all kinds of things falling down. And then I was walking around the little town park, and a gentleman from across the street came out and told me the kind of the history of the town, because he's lived here since he was a little kid, and he can remember this stretch right here where this is the fire department, and I think this is the city hall. But there were businesses and restaurants and bars and hotels and everything through here, and because the railroad was there, and there was I think maybe a little bit there's a lumber yard and a railroad right down the hill. So we're on top of a hill. With the drone footage you'll be able to see, so we're up on the top of the hill, and the railroad was down by the river, and there was also a lumber yard down there. So it was quite busy, and then the railroad stopped becoming a thing here, and things started moving away, and businesses started leaving, and that's when these towns get real small. He told me there were a couple bars that were here, and then there was a fight between bikers and cowboys, and basically bars got closed down, and that was the last businesses that were here. And so there's really nothing to come and do here, except for unless you know somebody, or you're just an oddball like me exploring the smallest towns. We're getting down to the really small towns now here in Beaconsfield, population 15, second smallest town in Iowa. In fact, it used to be tied for the smallest town, and it's gotten bigger. It went from 11 a couple decades ago up to 15. So I don't know if that's any sign that it'll continue to go up, but it definitely has some very interesting things. I'm sitting right here. This was the original first ever Hy-Vee store. Was started here by a man with the last name Hyde, and a man at the last name, this long name that starts with a V, and they combined to become Hy-Vee. And if you're from Iowa, you know how significant Hy-Vee is. It's a large chain of stores, and it's certainly expanded beyond more than just in Iowa. And so to think that this is where it started, in this little tiny town that only has 15 people, is pretty remarkable. Not only is the Hy-Vee started here, but there was an astronaut from here, and she flew 3 missions between 2009 and 2017, and she was born in 1960 and is from here. And the population figures were bigger in the early 1900s, around 200, and then it started going down. And by 1960, it was in just double digits. And so she was one of 50 people that lived here and became, you know, one of the lead astronauts in the last 15 years. So Beaconsfield has a lot of history. Here visiting today, it is incredibly quiet. There is not a soul around, and all you can hear are the, you know, birds chirping. But a few old buildings to check out, a church in town. I see, you know, the sheriff is sitting, his truck is sitting right over here. So keeping an eye on everything to make sure Beaconsfield stays safe. So really cool town to visit here in southwestern Iowa. We have finally made it to the smallest town in Iowa, Leroy. And this is a great small town. Sometimes I've done these videos and the smallest town is kind of odd for a reason. There's no one there, or one person, or maybe there's some sort of, you know, it's through some sort of liquor sales that it was a town. But this is just a small town that has faded down to 11 people, and they got some cool stuff to see here. But first, the history of it. It was formed on the railroad, and they had, you know, a couple hundred people in the early 1900s that lived here. You can actually, as you're kind of going through what is probably the old Main Street, there's old sidewalks, and you can see where some of the buildings, some abandoned buildings are. Right behind me is the city hall. It says population 34. That population was several decades ago. You know, just over time got smaller and smaller, and was in 2010 it was tied for the smallest town with Beaconsfield, the last town we were at, and then it's gotten smaller down to 11. Besides these kind of abandoned buildings on the main street, there's an old school that really stands out as you come into town. It looks like probably is a, you know, privately owned at this point, and they have a great sign. So obviously there's the 11 people that live here have some pride in their town. So very cool, great way to end the series about the smallest towns in Iowa. And that's the list. What was your favorite town? Iowa has some great small towns, and on this list, they were really good. I've done this 6 or 7 times with different states, and Iowa certainly has some of the more interesting, smallest, tiniest towns I've ever been to. So great job, Iowa. Keep that history going, and we'll see you next time. Did have some coal mining. Hey, we got a buddy here. Hi. Hi. It's not exactly the bridges of Madison County, but we'll see how strong it is. Very sturdy. Got to get across that major river. I'm not sure I want to look in there. I know you want me to look in there. We'll look in the men's. Oh, much better than I thought it would be. On the way back, we're going to wade through the river. It's still going. What the heck do they put in the Wheel of Death in Ellston? Maine and Blaine.
Oh, the dog deserves to be. Dog's adorable.
And but then a lot of no trespassing signs, so a no mowing sign. I guess that's a good problem to have if people are mowing your grass for you.